We now have two ways of filling the gap between monopoly and perfect competition. The first was to think about oligopoly competition, where an oligopoly is just a collection of firms that's protected by barriers to entry, just like a monopoly is. But they compete with one another. And when they compete based on quantity, where quantity is the strategic variable as it was in the Cournot model, we found that the oligopoly produces more output than the monopoly would, and as a result, price will be below the monopoly price. And we also found that the larger the number of firms in the oligopoly, the more the oligopoly produces, and the lower the price will be. So as the number increases and gets really large, we converge to the perfectly competitive outcome of price being equal to marginal cost. We then thought of a second way of filling the gap, and that is by thinking about price competition. But when we first thought about price competition in an oligopoly, in the Bertrand model, we found that that price competition was so fierce that as soon as there was a second firm, we jumped from monopoly straight to perfect competition and price being equal to marginal cost. But then when we introduced product differentiation, we found that product differentiation softens that price competition. And finally, we introduced a fixed entry cost into the market in the circle model and found that as that fixed entry cost falls, more firms enter the industry, and as a result, each firm will have less market power. As that market power falls, prices fall. And as that fixed entry cost falls towards zero, prices converge to the competitive outcome of price equal to marginal cost. This second type of market structure is called monopolistic competition. And the key feature of monopolistic competition is that the firms that have entered the industry are making positive profit, but the firms outside of the industry would make negative profit by entering. The difference between the two firms is that the firms in the industry have already paid the fixed entry cost. It is now a sunk cost for them. But the firms outside of the industry have not paid that fixed entry cost. It is not a sunk cost for them as they think about entering that market. And so they take that cost into consideration. And the number of firms in the industry will have settled so that the next firm entering would be making a negative profit by entering when we count their fixed costs. So now we can think about what does the picture of the firm within the industry look like. We know that each firm within the industry has a differentiated product and as a result has some market power. As a result, it's going to face a downward sloping demand curve for its product. A downward sloping demand curve is the telltale sign of having market power. So they'll face a downward sloping demand curve. And if that demand curve is linear, we know that the marginal revenue curve starts at the same point but has twice the slope. We can then add the marginal cost curve for the firm, and we get a picture that looks a whole lot like the picture for a monopoly. That's because these firms are little monopolies. They have market power just like a monopoly does. So these firms will then produce where a marginal cost intersects marginal revenue and price along the demand curve just like a monopoly does. And within that picture we can see the profit that the firms in the industry are making, assuming that there are no additional recurring fixed costs. That profit is simply the total revenue box, price times quantity, minus the total costs, which are captured by the marginal cost curve, as long as there are no recurring fixed costs. The marginal cost is just the cost of the first unit plus the additional cost of the second unit and so forth. So the area underneath the marginal cost curve is the total cost of the firm if it's not facing recurring fixed costs. Subtracting that from the total revenue box, we get a profit of this area. But that's not the profit a firm that's outside of the industry would get by entering the industry, because that firm still has to pay the fixed entry cost. And we can't see that fixed entry cost in that picture. We can't see any fixed costs in that picture. And we've simply assumed the firms within the industry don't have recurring fixed costs. But if we were to put fixed costs in, we would do so with the average cost curve, where we would include, in addition to all of these marginal costs, that fixed entry cost. And we know that firms have entered as long as this profit was larger than the fixed entry cost, so that the fixed entry cost must now roughly be equal to the profit that firms would make if they entered. That would imply that the average cost curve has to be roughly tangent at this point. So if I put the average cost in here, I made it roughly tangent at this point on the demand curve where the firm is operating. Because at that point, the average cost is then equal to price. So we know that's our total revenue box. We can subtract from that the total cost including the fixed cost by multiplying the average cost times output. And if the average cost curve is tangent at this point, then the total cost curve will be exactly equal to the total revenue curve. In other words, the firm would make zero profit by entering into the industry once it takes into account that fixed entry cost. So for the firms outside of the industry, the average cost must look something like this, maybe be slightly above, so the firm would actually make a negative profit by entering. But it would look something like that. So in a monopolistically competitive market, firms have come in as long as they could make a profit by coming in. They'll stop being able to make a profit by coming in once the picture looks like this.